I'm going to speak on an issue that is near and dear to masters, mates, and pilots. It's really a warning shout about a disaster waiting to happen with regards to the expanded Panama Canal. There are labor-intensive operations on the canal. The Neopanamax vessels increase risks to both mariners, line handlers, and international commerce. And that's what I'm going to speak about today. Next slide, please. Full disclosure, Masters, Mates, and Pilots is a labor organization. We represent approximately 5,000 deep sea and inland mariners aboard U.S. flag vessels. We've been around since 1887, and our mission is to improve conditions and status of merchant mariners. We are affiliated with the Union of Captains and Deck Officers of the Panama Canal, and we, along with the International Transport Workers and the Nautilus Federation, want to bring attention to what we believe is truly a lamentable situation that could easily result in a disaster. If you're not familiar with the ITF, the International Transport Workers Federation, they are the leading voice for the welfare and safety and human rights of seafarers around the world. They include some 700 transport workers unions in all sectors of transportation from over 140 countries and some 20 million transport workers. In the maritime industry, they've been at the forefront dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, which has brought great hardship to mariners, as you all know. Some 400,000 at one time were stuck aboard their ships awaiting repatriation. Some 50 vessels are abandoned in ports around the world without their owners taking care of the crew. And the hardship for mariners, particularly flag of convenience mariners, has been appalling and recognized by the United Nations and the International Maritime Organization, but really little done to remedy the situation. Also, we work with the Nautilus Federation, which is a federation of some 20 unions, primarily ships officer unions, and we work within the parameters of the ITF to promote seafarers' welfare, mutual cooperation on a global basis, and also to give a response to the increasing criminalization of ships' officers and crew. Next slide, please. So we're all familiar with what happened in the Suez Canal recently. This was not a one-off. The ultra-large container ships, Neopanamax vessels as well, they are difficult to maneuver. They were built for fuel efficiency, decarbonization per unit of cargo moved. They result in a vessel with very high horsepower engine and a stall speed close to 10 knots. They are really not suitable for harbor and mooring maneuvers. They're designed to be the most efficient way to move a large volume of cargo across oceans. In-port operations, canal operations become a lot more problematic. The vessels have an undersized, for the most part, an undersized rudders to reduce drag from rudder when they're at sea speed, but they're inefficient at slow speeds. In narrow channels, the hydrodynamic interaction with channel banks, bank suction, and bow cushion can cause a tendency for the ship to shear away from the closest canal bank. The rudders are too small to deal with this, and the ships risk grounding on an opposite bank, which is exactly what we believe happened in the Suez Canal. Furthermore, the vessels are highly vulnerable to wind effect with a large amount of exposed surface area. And you can see that clearly enough in this picture. And again, they suspect that had a role to play in the disaster in the Suez Canal. Long and short of it is the vessels in port, in canals, are highly dependent on the use of tugboats for control under usual port operating conditions. Next slide, please. Again, this is the challenge. These vessels are built for efficiency. They're at sea, not necessarily for maneuverability and ship handling in port or in canals. Next slide, please. We have the engineering marvel of the new canal. We believe there are some design flaws to this engineering marvel that cost $5.2 billion. But for anyone that's seen it, it is absolutely impressive and a great boost to international trade. There are two new lock systems, the Cocoli on the Pacific side, the Agua Clara on the Atlantic side. It's one-way traffic, so you've got transits in one direction and in the other direction sequentially. The new lock chambers are much enlarged from a length of 1,050 feet to 1,400 feet, from a width of 110 feet to 180, and a depth from 41 feet to almost 50 feet. Key design changes: there are no electric locomotive mules. For those familiar with the old canal system, which is still in use, of course, the locomotive mules run on tracks alongside the lock chambers and the approaches to the lock chambers. They are equipped with tension winches, so they help guide, position the vessels securely in the lock chamber. Those locomotives do not exist. Those tension winches do not exist. And instead, it has become a labor-intensive operation, both with tugboats to control the movement of the vessel and with line handlers who join the vessel, who handle ship's lines to and from the dock, resulting in a much more labor-intensive operation. As far as the approach walls, one major change, again, was the lack of an approach wall on the south side of the Agua Clara locks, which makes that particular approach, what is subject to sudden winds and conditions, particularly hazardous, as it's difficult to line up and bring the vessel into the canal lock chamber without the use of tugs. Even in the old canal, with much smaller and more maneuverable ships, alignment with the ship with the entrance of the lock is critical, and it's accomplished by landing the ship on the approach wall and then aligning the ship with the locks by sliding the ship into the lock with the aid of locomotives from the approach wall. This is no longer possible with the new canal. Next slide, please. Here you see the old existing locks and the new locks, considerably different in size. And here is what is happening now. If you look on the right side of your screen, you have a 1,400-foot lock chamber. You have, until last week, a maximum size of a 1,200-foot ship. And then you have a 90-foot tug called an alpha tug on the bow and a 90-foot tug called the delta tug on the stern. So if you do the math, there's not a lot of room to spare. 10 to 20 feet on each side. Of course, not all ships are 1,200 feet, but there is little room for error. Next slide, please. Here you have a picture of the Agua Clara locks looking north towards the Atlantic. As you can see, there's no approach wall. Next slide, please. Here are the Cocoli Locks. This is looking south towards the Pacific Ocean. You can see Panama City off to the left. And here you do have an approach wall, but there are no locomotives with tension winches to help position the vessel. Instead, you can see, if you look closely, 4 tugs on this alongside this vessel. There's one on the bow, one on the stern, and 2 on the port side of the ship. Next slide, please. Here we have a nighttime operation. And of course, any operation at night is more hazardous than daytime operations, particularly when you consider fatigue and circadian rhythms of crew. Next slide, please. The result, you have a very highly intensive labor operation. You have tug crews and line handlers that are doing much more labor intensive work than what's taking place in the old canal. The performance of personnel is essential, and the quality of the equipment is essential. You can't have a tugboat failure, particularly the Alpha tug, that's right directly under the bow of the ship. It just doesn't, you can't have a failure. You can't afford to have a tugboat failure. There's little margin for error. Next slide, please. Here you see an operation, typical, with lining up the ship to go into one of the new lock chambers. 4 tugs are involved. Next slide, please. Here's the old system. Those of you, and I'm sure there's many out there that are familiar with this, the locomotive mules are alongside, they're on the lock wall. They help position the vessel and slide it into the lock chamber. Next slide, please. Here you have a view with the ship directly astern of the Alpha tug. And it doesn't take a lot of imagination to think if you're the tugboat operator or the deckhand on that tug, and you've got maybe up to 150,000 tons directly astern of you, you can't really screw up. You're going to get a little twitchy when things go wrong. There's 2 lines, which is a standard operation, 2 lines from the tug to the bow of the ship, and those are necessary to control the vessel. And of course, they require some careful line handling and coordination from ship to the tug. Next slide, please. Here you have a view of the Alpha tug with the vessel that is not maximum size vessel, but even there you see that the tug, the bow, and the lock gate doesn't give a lot of leeway. Next slide, please. Another view, again, the Alpha tug with a bulk carrier. Next view. Similar view. Next slide, please. Similar. And you see the lines from the stern of the tug to the bow of the ship with another escort tug. And you can see a third one just behind the tug on the starboard side of the ship's hull there. Next slide, please. A couple more slides that give you an idea of the line handling involved. Next slide. Here's the Delta tug, which is the tug on the stern of the vessel. 1 on the bow, 1 on the stern, and then 2 other assisting tugs. Those 2 assisting tugs do not enter the lock chamber. Only the Alpha and the Delta tug, bow and stern, actually entered the lock chamber. Next slide, please. Another view. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. And here we have vessels alongside the hull of a ship, tugs alongside the hull. Next slide. Here's a view of some tugboat tow lines that were in use prior to a fatal accident. I'm happy to say that this appalling situation apparently has been rectified. The Panama Canal Authority has made sure that the tow lines being used now are in better condition than at this stage of the operation a few years ago. But the fact is that lines of this quality and ship's own lines that are used when you're tied up alongside the lock walls, they can be in varying conditions, and they have to be properly maintained and replaced when needed. These obviously were not. These were actual tug tow lines coming from a Panama Canal Authority tug. Next slide, please. This is Osvaldo de la Espada, who was killed. He was a line handler, killed with a parting of a line during line handling operations inside a lock chamber. That fatality took place in 2017. Next slide, please. As the flag state, the Panama Canal Authority is the regulatory agency for Panama. As many of you are familiar with the Panama Maritime Authority. They handle the world's largest registry of flag of convenience vessels. Panama is signatory to the Maritime Labor Convention of 2006. Between the Panama Maritime Authority as the local flag state and the Panama Canal Authority, which runs and operates the Panama Canal, they are required to meet IMO standards for near coastal vessels for Panamanian registered tugs. The documentation of records, hours of work, hours of rest required by both the IMO standards of training, certification, and watchkeeping, STCW, and rest of the Maritime Labor Convention, they are not being recorded as required under either of these standards. The Panama Canal Authority says they don't need to do that because they have an 8-hour 3-watch system, and at the Panama Canal Authority, ACP, in the Spanish abbreviation, because they say the ACP tracks crew members' hours of work and rest. And in theory, they do have a 3-watch system. In practice, it turns out to be much different, with routine watches and work going 12 or more hours, and then crew members commuting to and from their homes, which in Panama, if anyone's been there recently, the traffic in driving around Panama is not smooth. It's a congested area when you approach where these crew changes take place. Next slide, please. Because of the situation that was quickly recognized with the opening of the new canal and the labor-intensive processes, the ITF in June of 2018 commissioned a study. This study was completed in December of 2018, and it was conducted by 2 experts. And if you go to the next slide, I'll give you a little more about the people that conducted this study. One was Dr. Barry Strutch, who was an international expert, former NTSB investigating supervisor and national resource specialist, and a Dr. Isabel Gonzalez, who is an occupational health and safety expert, former head of the Panamanian National Program on Occupational Safety, and president of the Panama Association of Specialists of Occupational Medicine. These 2 experts were commissioned by the ITF to do a study. They interviewed some 50 of the approximately 150 tugboat captains that work in the canal for the Panama Canal Authority. And they made certain findings and recommendations that I will describe in a couple of minutes. This was a submission by the ITF to the International Maritime Organization of 28 September 2018, based on the study of Dr. Strauch and Dr. Gonzalez. Next slide, please. And the next slide. These were the submissions by the 2 investigators. Next slide, please. There was an accident in 2017, which points out the hazards involved. Fortunately, this one did not result in injury or fatality, but it goes to show what is going to happen sooner or later, particularly if these issues of fatigue and rest are not addressed. In 2017, there was a collision between the tug Cerro Santiago and the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Tampa. The NTSB did an investigation. Their findings, number 18, the tugmaster had worked 12-hour shifts on the 2 days prior to his accident. At the time of his accident, the tugmaster was at the end of his shift from 1600 to midnight and was waiting to be relieved. The fault was placed on the master of the tug. He admitted he fell asleep while maneuvering the tug, and the collision occurred. The Panama Canal Authority, opinion number 14, they say there was no fault on the part of the Panama Canal Authority, but it certainly is a fault on the Panama Canal Authority if they're letting their masters of tugs, their personnel exceed the STCW and the MLC hours of work and rest and not doing anything about it. And this is happening on a regular, if not routine, basis. Next slide, please. Last month, on 29th of April, and in the week following that, Panama Canal workers, who number some 1,500 overall workers in the canal, protested to the Panama Canal Authority. Their health and safety issues, they're not being addressed either by the Panamanian regulatory authorities or the Panama Canal Authority itself, or being addressed in collective bargaining. Next slide, please. LNG, it's a growing sector, and the world commerce is being more and more dependent on the transport of LNG cargoes. As you can see, the number of these transits is increasing and will continue to increase as LNG fuel becomes more and more predominant. These are Neopanamax size vessels, and this trade is increasingly important. Next slide, please. Overall transits, you can see from 27, and this is in the new canal, the number has gone up. It was 1,500 the first year, 2016, 2017, 2,488, 2018, 2,643, 2019, 2,962, and 2020, 3,280. There's almost 9 transits per day through the canals, and each with 4 tugs. And then you include the transits in the other canals, the older canals, you've got some 12,000 to 13,000 transits per year through a grand total of 18 different locks, and a tremendous workload, both on people and equipment. And the increased number of transits is not commensurate with an increased number of tugboats or an increased number of tug captains. The tug captains being often the most critical because they're on the controls throughout the entire operation, which could mean some 12 hours on a tugboat controls without a break. Even getting a break for personal reasons to use the head can be problematic at times for these tugboat captains. Next slide, please. Safety and efficiency requires protection of the human element. We all know that. Everyone familiar in our industry knows fatigue is an issue. Fatigue is an issue that should not be ignored. The SDCW hours of work requirements are often more honored in the breach than in the carrying out of them. STCW logs, hours of rest logs are important. They need to be adhered with. Protection of the human element means you have to have adequate rest. You have to have a safe workplace. You have to have a safety culture free from intimidation. When these workers at the canal raise their issues, they are either blown off or studiously insulted or ignored. There needs to be due process. You need appropriate and well-maintained equipment. Tugboat fleet needs to be adequate for the task at hand. to work in the lock chambers. Right now, there are 46 total number of tugs for the entire canal system. Of those, only 36 are operable in any given day. 10 are undergoing maintenance and repair. And of those 36 operational tugs, 14 are equipped, are the latest state-of-the-art tugs with 82 bollard pull towing capacity. Those are used for the Alpha and Delta tugs. There are 13 other more modern tugs, tractor tugs, with 65 bollard pull. But between these 14 tugs and the additional 13, these are the critical elements to make this work. There are no replacement tugs right now lined up. Maintenance is an issue. And if you're working the tugs and the people around the clock and you're increasing the transits every year, something has to give. And it could be a lock gate, or it could be a collision, or it could be more fatalities. Next slide, please. Taking care of people and equipment is essential. Next slide. Here you see an overview, a picture of the new lock with their lock gates. There are double gates, but if anything happens to one of those gates, you're going to shut down the new canal. You're going to close all Neopanamax traffic going through the canal, and you're going to have a crisis in world trade. And it's going to take a lot longer to repair this than it did to refloat the Ever Given. You can see on the left picture where that tug is wedged under the bow of the container ship and the lock gate. Next slide, please. Recommendations. This is based on the study, and they were presented to the IMO at IMO Safety Committee meeting in 2018. Recommendations to involve tugboat captains in decision-making concerning their working conditions. And this dovetails right into the point that our previous speaker made regarding listening to the fishermen. You have to involve the people on the front line when you make new designs to lock gates, when you talk about safety issues, when you talk about how an operation is conducted. Unfortunately, the Panama Canal Authority, although they do listen to their pilots, apparently, and actually, absolutely, do not listen to the tugboat crews, the line handling crews, and the other personnel involved with safety in the canal. The other recommendation, investigate occupational marine accidents. That's pretty basic, but they should be by qualified and objective personnel and report directly to the government of Panama, not to the Panama Canal Authority. Establish a mechanism within the government of Panama and the authority to ensure that all safety and occupational health recommendations are fully considered and implemented properly. Implement a fatigue risk management system to ensure operational safety and reduce exposure to work-related adverse health effects. It's also proposed that the Panamanian government require the Panama Canal Authority to do the following. Next slide, please. Establish written hours of service for operational personnel. To 1, take circadian rhythms into account by providing sufficient time for tugboat captains to adjust their sleeping patterns to each schedule change. 2, limit the number of continuous hours that tugboat captains are permitted to work. 3, provide rest facilities near tugboat captains' work sites. And 4, provide a minimum rest period between shifts to allow tugboat captains sufficient rest to counter the effects of extended work periods and nighttime tugboat operations. An additional recommendation was to restore the second captain during transits through the locks. When the new locks were first utilized, a second captain was included in the crew complement on tugs to assist in relieving the primary captain. That was discontinued unilaterally without consultation. And even the Panama Canal's own study, the Panama Canal Authority's own study by the Maritime Group in 2017 recommended that a quote unquote learned hand, which is the equivalent of a mate, be included in operating these tugs. You cannot keep someone on the controls of the tug continuously for the number of hours that's being done at this time. Something is going to give. Next slide, please. This is another recommendation, establish an organizational structure that allows operational personnel to report safety-related deficiencies without reprisal to personnel within the organization, with the authority and willingness to correct them, to conduct investigations to all occupational and marine accidents objectively, and issue findings and recommendations directly to the government of Panama, and to follow up with recommendations to the government of Panama, not to the authority, to ensure all recommendations are being fully considered. This was stated in an IMO submission by the ITF at Maritime Safety Committee on 28 September 2018. At that meeting at the IMO, these findings were rejected by the Panama Canal Authority, and the continuing response by the Panama Canal Authority, including to the latest wave of demonstration, has been to turn a blind eye. Well, that's well and good. You can turn a blind eye, but sooner or later, something is going to happen if this trend continues without being addressed. Next slide, please. Risk to life and commerce are real. It doesn't take a lot of imagination when you look at the pictures earlier in this presentation and you look at the location of the Alpha tug and the work that the line handlers have to do to know that life is at risk. Well, commerce is also at risk as Neopanamax vessels are becoming the standard for a great portion of international trade. Next slide. As recently as last Friday, contrary to addressing the problem and making conditions better, the Panama Canal Authority issued a directive allowing the size of the vessels in the lock chamber to be increased a further 15 feet from 1,200 to 1,215 feet. So now you have a situation, instead of a 1,200-foot ship and a 90-foot tugboat on each end, in a 1,400-foot lock chamber, you have a 1,215-foot vessel. Well, obviously, the risk is being increased. The size of the lock chambers has not grown. The tugboats have not gotten any shorter. But in light of all of this information, the Panama Canal Authority has chosen to increase the size of vessels allowed in the lock chambers. This is irresponsible and put lives and commerce at risk. Next slide, please. We should all know, I think most of us in this meeting agree, safety should come first. After a disaster is not the time to reevaluate. Next slide.